For nearly 8 decades, Japan played the role Washington wrote for it: obedient, loyal, predictable. But that script has just been burned. In a moment that will go down in Pacific history, Japan's newly elected Prime Minister Sai Takai stood before the cameras and said the words no one expected to hear. Japan will be an ally, not a vassal. It was more than a declaration, it was defiance. And it hit Washington like an earthquake. Donald Trump, who had slapped 35% tariffs on Japanese cars and electronics, thought Japan would fold like it did in the 1980s under the Plaza Accord. But this time, Japan didn't bow, it bit back. Behind closed doors, Takai told the U.S. ambassador, "If America disrespects Japan's sovereignty, we will strike at the heart of your economy." And she wasn't bluffing. Because Japan's next move, from de-dollarization to regional alliances, could unravel the American-led order built after World War II. This is the story of how a quiet island nation became the loudest threat to U.S. economic power, and how Trump's tariffs just triggered the biggest geopolitical power shift in the Pacific since 1945. Sai Takai's story is already the stuff of legend. The daughter of an engineer and a schoolteacher, she built her career in Japan's Ministry of Economy, never afraid to clash with the bureaucrats who treated the U.S. as a master, not a partner. When she ran for prime minister, few believed she could win, not just because she was Japan's first female leader, but because she promised something the country hadn't heard in decades: independence. Her victory speech was calm, but every word landed like a blade. "We respect America," she said, "but we will never be ruled by it again." The phrase exploded online, shared millions of times across Asia. Young voters, tired of watching Tokyo bend to Washington's every demand, rallied behind her. Trump's inner circle initially laughed it off. They assumed she'd fall in line once the pressure mounted. But inside the first 48 hours of her government, she summoned the U.S. ambassador and quietly rewrote the rules of engagement. "If the United States treats Japan as an equal," she said, "the alliance stands. But if Trump continues weaponizing tariffs, Japan will retaliate not with missiles but with money." Her plan: to strike the U.S. economy where it's most fragile, its debt. When Sai Takai warned Washington that Japan would strike at the heart of the American economy, few in the U.S. realized she wasn't talking about trade, she was talking about debt. For decades, Japan has quietly been one of the largest holders of U.S. Treasury bonds, those pieces of paper that keep the American government running. At over $1.1 trillion, Japan's bond portfolio isn't just an investment. It's leverage, it's a silent weapon that can shake Wall Street without firing a shot. Inside Tokyo's Ministry of Finance, Takai's first major act was to create a special working group to study how to gradually reduce dependence on the dollar. On paper, it looked like an administrative task. But in reality, it was a geopolitical warning. If Trump continued to use tariffs as economic blackmail, Japan would use the bond market as retaliation. Even a partial sell-off of Japanese holdings could send U.S. interest rates soaring, crash the bond market, and make it far more expensive for Washington to borrow. Analysts at Nikkei Asia and Bloomberg warned that such a move could trigger global panic. America's strength has always depended on others trusting its debt. If Japan, the world's third-largest economy, began pulling back, it would send a message to every nation still clinging to the dollar. The age of blind trust is over, and that's exactly what Takai wanted to signal. Japan wasn't looking for chaos, it was demanding respect. The debt weapon wasn't about destroying the United States, it was about forcing it to see Japan as an equal. For the first time since the Second World War, Tokyo wasn't acting like America's banker. It was acting like its creditor with conditions, and Washington was terrified of the bill coming due. What started as a quiet financial maneuver soon became a public declaration. Japan was stepping away from the dollar. Under Sai Takai's leadership, Tokyo launched a new economic doctrine, one that called for trade across Asia to be settled not in U.S. currency, but in yen. For decades, the dollar had been the oxygen of the global economy. Every major transaction, every major debt flowed through it. But now, the world's third-largest economy was saying enough. In a leaked document from Japan's Economic Security Council, officials wrote that the world is entering an era of currency pluralism. The dollar can no longer be the only instrument of trust. Those words reverberated across Asia. Suddenly, the Philippines, Vietnam, and Malaysia began negotiating bilateral trade agreements in local currencies. China and India quickly voiced support, seeing Japan's move as a breakthrough against Washington's monetary dominance. Inside the U.S. Treasury, panic quietly spread. American analysts called it the yen revolt, warning that even a modest regional shift could reduce global demand for the dollar by 5–7% within 5 years, a blow the U.S. economy could not afford amid its record deficit. But Sai Takai was deliberate. This wasn't about rebellion for rebellion's sake, it was about freedom of choice. She told Parliament, "The strength of a nation begins when its currency reflects its independence." To Washington, that line was heresy. To Asia, it was inspiration. For the first time in modern history, Japan wasn't following a rulebook written in Washington, it was writing its own. And as trade in yen quietly expanded through Asia's ports and digital systems, the dollar's aura of invincibility began to flicker. America's financial empire had finally met a challenger, and it came from a former ally. Donald Trump doesn't take defiance lightly, especially when it comes from a country that Washington once considered untouchable. The moment reports surfaced of Japan's yen-based trade deals and debt diversification plans, the White House went into retaliation mode. Trump's advisors drafted what they called pressure protocols, designed to remind Tokyo who held the power. But Japan wasn't the same post-war partner anymore, it had leverage of its own. Leaked notes from Politico Asia revealed Trump's fury behind closed doors. "If Japan wants independence," he allegedly said, "then it can pay for it." Those words made headlines in Tokyo and ignited outrage. To the Japanese public, this wasn't just an insult. It was a reminder of occupation, a shadow of the 1940s that they believed had long faded. Within hours, Japan's defense minister responded live on national television. "We do not need permission to defend our sovereignty." That single statement changed everything. The U.S. began hinting at reassessing military agreements, even the deployment of American bases on Japanese soil. But Pentagon officials quietly warned Trump that this was dangerous territory. Those bases weren't charity, they were the backbone of U.S. influence in the Pacific. Removing them would weaken America, not Japan. Meanwhile, Sai Takai didn't flinch. She unveiled the Pacific Equal Partnership, a doctrine declaring that Japan's defense policy would now be guided by equality, not dependence. Her message was clear. Japan would continue working with America, but only as a partner, never a pawn. For Washington, this was mutiny. For Japan, it was liberation. And as military tensions simmered beneath the surface, a new reality set in. The United States no longer commanded automatic obedience in Asia, not even from its oldest ally. As tensions with Washington deepened, Sai Takai looked not west across the Pacific, but south toward Seoul and Canberra. For decades, America had kept its Asian allies divided, quietly ensuring that Japan and South Korea never became too close. But Takai saw through that playbook. She understood that the only way to counter U.S. pressure was to create something bigger than American dominance, an Asian alliance built on trust, technology, and trade. Within months, her government initiated secret-level talks with South Korea's president and Australia's prime minister. The result was a quiet but revolutionary pact, the Asian Innovation Alliance. Its mission was simple: reduce dependency on American supply chains, build regional self-sufficiency, and create a tech future owned by Asia, not licensed by Silicon Valley. The alliance's flagship project, a $200 billion innovation and defense fund, jointly financed by Japan, South Korea, and Australia. It aimed to link Japan's robotics and semiconductor industries with Korea's microchip expertise and Australia's critical minerals. This wasn't just about cooperation, it was about rewriting the rules of global production. Western media dubbed it the Asian Renaissance. Washington called it economic defection. But in Asia, it was hailed as the beginning of a new century, one where regional powers could trade, innovate, and defend themselves without waiting for U.S. approval. In Tokyo, massive billboards carried a simple slogan: "Asia builds for Asia." Trump's tariffs had unintentionally accomplished what decades of diplomacy never could: they united America's closest allies against it. And while Washington fumed, Sai Takai smiled. Because for the first time in living memory, Japan wasn't following orders from the West, it was leading a movement in the East. A movement that was no longer about alliance, it was about autonomy. When Japan moved, the markets trembled. What began as quiet defiance quickly turned into a global financial tremor. Within days of Tokyo's de-dollarization plan becoming public, U.S. Treasury yields started to rise, signaling investors' fear that Japan, the world's largest foreign holder of American debt, was preparing to dump U.S. bonds. Wall Street brushed it off at first, calling it political noise. But within weeks, the tremors turned into panic. Moody's Analytics issued a stark warning: if Japan begins unwinding even 10% of its U.S. holdings, the global financial order will destabilize. The statement triggered what traders nicknamed the Pacific Quake. The dollar-yen exchange rate swung violently, marking its highest volatility since 2015. Asian currencies strengthened while the dollar slipped, signaling that the world was beginning to hedge against America's dominance. In South Korea and Taiwan, central banks quietly began adjusting their portfolios too, reducing exposure to the U.S. dollar and diversifying into yen and euros. Even European investors, alarmed by Washington's trade chaos, followed suit. For the first time in decades, the dollar's untouchable aura cracked. Economists drew parallels to the 1985 Plaza Accord, when Washington forced Tokyo to manipulate its currency, crippling Japan's economy for a decade. But this time, Japan was not the victim, it was the architect. Prime Minister Takai addressed Parliament with measured confidence. Economic sovereignty is not isolation. It is the foundation of respect. Her words echoed across Asia and into financial centers from Singapore to Frankfurt. Markets understood what she was really saying. Japan was building a world where no single nation could weaponize its currency again. And for the first time since World War II, Washington realized the dollar might not always be king. While Washington fumed and markets trembled, something deeper was happening inside Japan, a national awakening. Under Sai Takai, economic defiance evolved into cultural pride. She wasn't just rewriting trade policy. She was redefining what it meant to be Japanese in the modern world. Her speeches no longer sounded like those of a technocrat, they sounded like a leader resurrecting her nation's soul. In one address that went viral across Japanese media, she declared, "Strength is not a threat, strength is dignity." Those 5 words became a mantra. Overnight, they appeared on university banners, protest placards, and digital billboards across Tokyo. The youth, long criticized for apathy, began rallying behind her message of economic patriotism. They saw in her not just a politician, but a symbol of rebirth. Factories that once outsourced production to foreign partners began reopening domestic lines. Government programs prioritized local manufacturing of microchips, batteries, and semiconductors. Made in Japan wasn't just a label again, it was a declaration of independence. The cultural wave spread fast. Musicians, filmmakers, and artists started infusing national themes into their work. Japanese cinema revived stories of honor, resilience, and quiet defiance. Even anime studios began weaving patriotic symbolism into modern narratives. Polls reflected the shift. Over 80% of citizens now supported reducing dependency on the US, and trust in Washington fell to an all-time low. But rather than hostility, this was healing, Japan rediscovering its identity after decades of restraint. Sai Takai's Japan didn't roar with arrogance. It stood tall in silence, its strength radiating from composure, not confrontation. And as the world watched, one truth became undeniable: Japan was no longer America's reflection. It had become its reminder that true power is the courage to stand alone with dignity. What began as a tariff dispute between Trump and Tokyo has evolved into something far greater, a reordering of the Pacific world. For nearly 8 decades, Japan was treated as America's junior partner, expected to follow, to agree, and to obey. But with Sai Takai's rise, that dynamic shattered. The Japan of quiet diplomacy and reluctant compliance is gone. In its place stands a nation that finally understands its worth, a nation unafraid to demand equality from the very superpower that once defined its limits. Trump's tariffs were meant to corner Japan, to force submission through economic pain. Instead, they forged steel, a harder, prouder, more self-reliant Japan. The US may still have aircraft carriers in the Pacific, but Japan now commands something far more powerful: influence built on respect. By shifting trade to the yen, leading new Asian alliances, and standing firm against economic coercion, Tokyo has shown that strength can come from restraint, and that power built on dignity lasts longer than fear. Across Asia, smaller nations are taking notes. Vietnam, Indonesia, even Malaysia now echo Japan's strategy: diversify, de-dollarize, and decide your own future. The Pacific, once America's backyard, is transforming into a region of equals. And as Washington grapples with this new reality, one lesson stands above all: empires don't fall when they are defeated by rivals, they fall when their allies stop believing in them. Japan hasn't declared war on the United States, it has declared independence of will. And that single act, quiet, deliberate, unstoppable, marks the dawn of a new era in the Pacific. This is cross-border news, where the lines on the map are shifting and history is being rewritten, one nation at a time.